moms in the room, happy Mother's Day to you. Thanks for all you do. My mom's probably watching too, so happy Mother's Day, love you. All right. And for those of you, I realize today could be a day of joy, could be a hard day for you, and I get that. And so you're just in my thoughts as you're here today. I want to talk by talking about a very popular movie. You've probably seen it. It's called Forrest Gump. It might be one of the best movies of all time, just because it's so well written. We follow a boy who turns into a man named Forrest, who experiences, the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. He has this tight relationship with his mother, and it's an iconic movie. And the thing about this movie is you'll remember one of the lines from the movie is that whenever Forrest, who was also mentally challenged, whenever he would encounter danger like bullying or when he was fighting in Vietnam, he learned to do something whenever the situation was just too much. You remember the line? Run, Forrest, run. He did that his whole life. His whole life, whenever there was a difficult situation, he learned to run. He learned to run. And so at one point in his life, he got up off his porch and he just started running. In fact, he ran across America 5 times in a 3-year span. And that's the scene you see on the screen here. And while he was running, he just kept running and inspired all these people in the movie. Some reporters came up and they asked him, they said, hey, what made you want to do this? You're such an inspiration. And he said, no particular reason. I just, keyword, felt like running. What was it that made Forrest feel like running? I'll tell you what it was. He just lost his mom. He had such a close relationship with his mom. And then after that, his childhood best friend, later the girl he loved, Jenny, came back into his life, and they had this like romance and this, just amazing setting going on. And then one day she just leaves. And there's Forrest sitting on the porch, feeling alone, feeling sad, feeling a level of hurt, and he doesn't know what to do. The emotions are so strong, they're so all-encompassing, he just gets up and he starts running. Have you ever wanted to run away? The emotions are heavy. The situation is intense. Have you ever wanted to do that? Can I be honest with you all? I'm going to change that. Can I be human? We're allowed to do that here, right? I can take off the expectations that everybody puts. You can take off the expectations you put on yourself. Let me just be human. At the end of last year, I felt like running away. Let me paint for you why. It's a lot of things. Not one thing, it's a lot of things. I'm a dad of 3 kids. Each of my kids are in different life stages, which requires different types of communication, which requires different types of coaching and different types of situations. They demand your time and energy. Parenting is difficult. Not to mention, I'm kind of selfish by nature. I am married to a wonderful, wonderful woman who I still cannot believe she wants to be married to me. Apparently you believe that as well. And anyway, marriage is great. It's wonderful. I truly love it. I truly love her. I'm just going to be human. Marriage is hard. It's hard. It's hard to be married sometimes. As I just sort of mentioned, on top of those 2 things, I have a human nature. I have a flesh nature. So what does that mean? That means there's things in me that well up, that try to take over. And I have to kind of push them down, There's thoughts that jump up that are just not so good. Or feelings that pop in that if I followed that feeling, that could lead to, a catastrophic circumstance. And so I'd have to wrestle with my weaknesses and my flaws. Not to mention at the end of last year, there was, if I were to be honest, I probably wouldn't have known at the time, but But there's relational hurt that I had in my life, and I was trying to forgive someone. And so that added to the feeling of wanting to fly away. On top of that, I manage chronic health issues, which requires that I have to get rest, that I have to have a particular diet. And when you're battling a chronic health issue, it just gets heavy and tiresome. On top of that, I'm a pastor. Okay, and this is a wonderful church. And you would think that, and this is amazing, I'm not complaining in any ways, but we've been a growing church. You would think that would make it easier, but it actually makes it harder because I feel the pressure, Don't mess up that next decision, I carry it home with me, It's hard. It's heavy. And sometimes, if I can just be human, I just want to run away. I just want to flee all responsibility to some place where none of that exists. I just want to go there. You ever feel like that? So I was reading the Psalms at the end of last year, and it put into words what I just expressed to you of what I was feeling. And St. Athanasius says most of Scripture speaks to us. It's prescriptive. It tells us what to do. But the Psalms, he says, they speak for us. They help us put words to the things that we're feeling. And the particular psalm that we're going to talk about today is Psalm 55. And so we're going to cover this whole psalm. This is a psalm written by David, and I'm going to just read the emotional part of this psalm that really captured my attention, but it's Psalm 55, 4 through 8, and we'll be in this psalm a lot today. Here's what it says. This is David writing. Psalm 55, verse 4, it says, My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling. What he's feeling is manifesting through his physical body outwardly for anyone to see. I'm trembling. It has beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had the wings of a dove. I would fly away. I would be at rest. I would flee far away. I would stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and the storm. Sometimes, like David, we just want to fly away, run away, far away. Whenever the stress is too much, whenever the circumstances become too difficult or too compounding, whenever the emotions are heavy, whenever our past is paralyzing our present, whenever something someone else is doing is hurting us, whenever the stakes are high, what do we want to do sometimes? Sometimes we just want to escape it. We just want to get away from it. We just want to find a refuge. We just want to take cover. We just want to block it out. We just want to numb it. Sometimes we just want to get as far away from it as we possibly can. What is that feeling? Today I want to talk about the feeling, the human emotion of overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. When you want to run away, you're feeling overwhelmed to stay. And how do you walk with God when you're feeling this way? How do you get from feeling overwhelmed to not feeling overwhelmed? Now, David's the author of this psalm, and he was in a season, as you can tell, where he was experiencing overwhelm. Naturally, we want to ask, what's causing this? And we'll get there in just a minute. But first, I just want to pause and give ourselves an understanding of what overwhelmed is, especially from a physiological perspective, somewhat a psychological perspective, but a physiological perspective. Overwhelm is when your central nervous system is in a constant state of fight or flight. which is why you want to run away when you feel overwhelmed, because you're physiologically wired to run away from what's a threat to you. The other side of that is sometimes when you're overwhelmed, it comes across in an aggression, or it erupts out of you. You don't want to run away. You want to take control. You want to, and you just act in a certain way. You fight for whatever you're going for. And so it's when your central nervous system is constantly either fighting for something or wanting to get away from something. It's when you're feeling more stress from external things and even internal pressures than your body is able to deal with. A chiropractor gave a TED Talk, Dr. Luke Reinhardt, and here's what he says about stress and feeling overwhelmed. Here's what he says. We have a capacity for stress. For some of you, that's all you needed to hear today. You have a capacity. We are not designed to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. When we try to take on more stress than our nervous system can adapt to, we feel overwhelmed. He later shares in this talk, which was fascinating to me, and the CDC reports this, 80% of disease is caused by stress, overwhelm. What do we take away from this quote? You are human. You have a limit, and oftentimes we're living beyond that limit. We're carrying more than we can actually physiologically carry. Let me give you a couple of symptoms of overwhelmed. You might be overwhelmed if you have racing thoughts. If you experience, times of confusion. If you have low energy, just lower than normal. If you have difficulty focusing. If you're finding it to be harder to solve problems, simple problems and difficult problems. If you find yourself wanting to withdraw from social situations rather than engage in social situations, and not like, around a bunch of strangers, like around people that you should want to be around. When you're feeling defeated, when you're worrying, when you're increasingly pessimistic, maybe you're having a lot of headaches lately or stomach aches. You're not sleeping, or you're sleeping way too much. You might be overwhelmed. How do we walk with God when we're feeling overwhelmed? Now, the Psalms were compiled as a prayer book for the exiles who were living in Babylon. So that's when all of these Psalms from different authors, most of them David, were put together, and it was kind of a virtual temple for the people who were living in exile. They had been, sacked by Babylon, completely overwhelmed by their enemy, and the reason why they were overwhelmed was because they hadn't surrendered or submitted to God's leading for their nation. And so they were in a difficult situation. They were warned over and over and over, it's going to come on you if you keep living like this. And it came on them. The temple was destroyed. They're no longer living at home. They've been pulled away from their homes and their countries. And so when they were putting this prayer book together, Psalm 55 was written by David. It was put in there explicitly to be a story of hope that these exiles who had been completely overwhelmed, going through all kinds of emotions, that when they would read this story, it would give them hope. They could meditate on this. And so in Psalm 55, it's really important for us to understand what is taking place in the life of David. What's making him feel overwhelmed? And what can we learn? And we're going to learn 5 lessons today on how to walk with God when we feel overwhelmed. But I've got to give you the backstory to this psalm. And the backstory to this psalm is actually a big chunk of David's life, 2 Samuel 11 through really the end of 2 Samuel, but especially 17, 18. Let me set the stage for you. David is literally fleeing. his palace in Jerusalem. He's the king, and he's on the run. Why? Well, his son, Absalom, has partnered up with Ahithophel, his most trusted advisor. And they have betrayed David, and they're conspiring to overthrow the kingdom. How did this happen? Because King David's like the most popular king in all the history of Israel. Let me tell you how. It started like this. One night on a rooftop, David was overcome with lust for a woman that wasn't his wife, to have relationships in the way God said you shouldn't have relationships, and he calls for the woman while her husband is out fighting his battles, and he sleeps with her. And then he tries to cover it up, and then he fails at covering it up, and so then he gets rid of her husband, meaning he kills him. And then he covers that up, and he gets away with it for a little while until he's called on it. And then he feels incredibly guilty. Bathsheba, the woman he had this affair with, has a son. The son doesn't live beyond just a few days. And so David is a wreck. He knows that he's caused all this pain in his life. A couple of years after this, his oldest son, Amnon, kind of like his father David, becomes overcome with lust for his half-sister. He just can't stop thinking about her. And so he coordinates a way to try to woo her, to sleep with him. And he fails. It doesn't matter to him. Essentially, he rapes her. And then he's disgusted with her. The plan falls apart. Well, this irritates, as you would imagine, David. He's angry. He's angry at his son. But he does nothing. Why does he do nothing? Maybe because in his son, he sees his own mistake. Maybe he feels a little insecure as a father because all his son is doing is what he did. And so his other son, Absalom, sees this, and he's outraged at his brother, Amnon. And so for 2 years, he plots to kill him. And then he does. Word gets to David, and David is just, he's so angry. He's mourning over the loss of his son, and Absalom flees town, thinking that something might come his way, but David does nothing. He just does nothing. A couple of years go by. The text says that David longs to see, his son Absalom, who's living in hiding. Finally, a counselor persuades him, hey, you should bring him back, let him live in the land. And so he agrees to let Absalom come back and live in the land, but he says, but I'm not going to see him. 2 more years go by until they finally see each other, and they have like a moment. However, Absalom's heart's already gone. The last 2 years, he's been wooing and devising a plan to get as many people on his side as he can so he can launch this coup over his father David. And so this is where we're at. And David's fleeing because now Absalom has enough people, and the people are behind him more than David. And they've seen this play out on the national stage. And it's on this journey, in that setting, that David writes Psalm 55. Now, do you see why he's overwhelmed? Let me read Psalm 55, 1 through 15, with all of that as a foundation. Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked. For they bring down suffering on me and assail me in their anger. We know who he's talking about. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and the storm. Lord, confuse the wicked, confound their words, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they prowl about on its walls. Malice and abuse are within it. Destructive forces are at work in the city. Threats and lies never leave its streets. If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide, but it is you. He's talking about his son. He's talking about his trusted advisor, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked about among the worshipers. Let death take my enemies by surprise. Let them go down alive to the realm of the dead, for evil finds lodging among them. This is overwhelming. What an overwhelming situation. Imagine the emotions. So lesson number one, the first thing you do when you're overwhelmed, when you're feeling overwhelmed, is you need to figure out why. You need to determine the cause. You need to clarify the why. Why am I feeling overwhelmed? And when we read in this text, we learn, especially in verse 13, you hear, it is you. It's the betrayal he's feeling. It's on top of the guilt he has about his past, on top of, the anger that's mixed in with that, on top of the shock at hearing about this, even more subtle, he probably feels a little bit like a failure as a parent, a little bit like a failure as a king, like he couldn't handle all the things that were placed on his shoulders, and his past is creeping up into his present life, and he's literally fearing for his physical life. He's experiencing the full range of emotions all at once. Remember the emotion wheel? He's feeling all of them, except the good ones. That's overwhelmed. Now, you have to identify if you're feeling overwhelmed or you think you're overwhelmed, what's causing this? And really, all of our overwhelm is caused essentially by three things. The first thing is my sin. Sometimes we feel overwhelmed because the results of my own behaviors and actions have netted me a very heavy load to carry. It's my fault. I made that decision. I sent that text message. I chose to sleep with her or him. It's my fault. Okay? So one reason you might be feeling overwhelmed is because there is something that you need to pay attention to that is in your past. It's in your record. Another reason why you might be feeling overwhelmed is because of their sin. Not your fault, but they hurt you. They said something to you. They went behind your back. They betrayed you. They don't respect you. They're not honoring you. And that's hard to deal with. The third reason you might be feeling overwhelmed is the circumstances that I'm in. So it's either my sin, their sin, or the circumstances I'm in, which the circumstances we're in is honestly created by my sin and their sin. Welcome to the world. This is the result of the fall of humanity. If I'm not sinning, they're sinning. And there's a lot of consequences that are happening in this world. It's happening to us. It's not necessarily our fault. It's not necessarily their fault. It's just the conditions of living in a fallen, sinful world. And what happens is we get in circumstances that we don't want, we can't control, we don't necessarily, haven't necessarily done anything to get them, but they're overwhelming. They're overwhelming. So we have to identify, okay, if I'm feeling overwhelmed, which of these three reasons is why? Is there some sinful behavior that I've tolerated, that I've unconfessed, that I've just let live in me and come out of me, and that's why I'm feeling overwhelmed? Are you greedy? Are you lustful? Do you have to have it your way all the time? I don't know. Is it hurt that you've experienced at the hands of someone else? If it is, you need to recognize, you need to understand, okay, this is what I'm feeling. This is what's overwhelming me. We're not saying that's okay, we're just saying recognize it so you can start to work through it. Finally, you might be overwhelmed because of what's happening to you. It might be an illness. It might be an unexpected tragedy. You might be involved in some kind of market that has just collapsed, or the industry has gotten really difficult, and that's the business you're in. It's creating all kinds of overwhelm, and now you're taking all of that overwhelm home. What's causing David's overwhelm? All three of those. His sin, other people's sin, and the circumstances that he's in. David elsewhere writes in Psalm 65:3, he says, "My guilt has overwhelmed me, like a burden too heavy to bear." First, clarify why you're feeling overwhelmed. It might not be your fault, but pay attention, because lesson number 2, even if it's not your fault, you're at risk for something. Lesson 2 and 3 are going to be things that you need to watch out for, because these things happen when we're overwhelmed. So number 2, identify the sins that is crouching. Identify the sin that is crouching. So when you're overwhelmed, understand there is a sin that you haven't let in that is crouching at the door of your life. Sin, by definition, it's choosing to trust in something other than God to provide you with what you desire most, which all of us desire most is the opposite of overwhelm. David says it in verse 6 of the Psalm, I want rest. I want to flee so I can have rest. Peace or pleasure or prosperity. That's what we're talking about when we say the other side of overwhelm. That's where we want to get. Sin is when you're trusting in anything else to provide you with rest and peace and happiness and prosperity. And so in Genesis 3, when the fall of man happens, when human beings choose to sin, to trust in something else other than God, in Genesis 4, we learn something very important about sin. And this is the situation between two brothers. Cain is upset. He's jealous. He's probably a little sad because he offered an inadequate sacrifice to God, and his brother Abel's was accepted by God. And so he has all of this, venom building up towards his brother. And then God shows up on the scene and he talks to him. And here's what he says. Genesis 4, 6 and 7 says, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin. Where is sin? Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Don't let it overwhelm you. And this is so important for us to learn, whether you're in a situation that is your own doing or you're in a situation that has no fault of your own. Hear me. Sin right now is crouching at your door. And it's not just enticing you. It's not just alluring you. It's trying to overwhelm you. It's trying to rule over you. The picture we're supposed to get here is the way, a lion is crouching, waiting for the opportune moment to attack its prey. Right now, if you're feeling overwhelmed, there is a lion crouching at the door of your life, waiting for you to open it up so it can devour you. Even if it's not your fault. See, oftentimes sin capitalizes on overwhelming circumstances, waiting for you to isolate just enough, to withdraw just enough, to justify the pride that's rising in you just enough so that it can convince you. It can convince you. It's trying to take you to an emotional place where it makes sense to reject what's right, to trust in yourself versus trusting in God. It's convincing you. It's crouching, it's convincing, but by nature, you cannot carry the weight. Physiologically, we need God, and when we decide to sin, we essentially say, I don't need God. And that's recipe for overwhelm. Genesis 4, 11 through 13 says, now you are under a curse because Cain killed his brother. He was ruled by the sin, crouching outside and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be restless. You won't have rest. You were overwhelmed. You thought this would take care of it. You thought this would make you feel good. You thought this would be the answer, but it's actually the opposite. You're a restless wanderer now. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. I'm overwhelmed by it. You see, sin crouches, and then it convinces, and then it crushes you. And it takes over your life. And we have to understand that when we're overwhelmed, there might be something crouching in our life. What's crouching outside your door? For David, lust was crouching outside his door. What wants to convince you to let it in because it's going to provide for you something to help ease the pain, to give you rest? Don't believe it. If it's not of God, it's going to lead to overwhelming you. The third lesson we can learn, this is a don't do. Detect the false shelters in your life. Did you see where David desired to go in his overwhelm? He wanted to flee, which we can relate to. But where he wants to go is a desert. Why? Well, he says, I want refuge and shelter. I want a place to, get through this storm until it passes. But by the way, the desert is probably the worst place to go find rest and refuge, right? Because there's no water, there's no vegetation, there's no habitants. It's depressing. It's empty. And so he tries to find true refuge as he goes away from Jerusalem into the desert. And we learn something here is that we all, like that, have false shelters that we flee to, that we think will be better for us. It's actually really human for us to want to go somewhere, to get away from something. And ultimately, that thing we're going to, we're hoping it will provide respite. We're hoping it will provide rest. We're hoping it will help us heal. We're hoping it will help us escape. We're hoping it will really be a true refuge through the storm so you can, be the better husband, so that you can get through this difficult season at work, so you can get through this illness. And we go to this refuge, and it's a false refuge. See, when we're overwhelmed, we run to things sometimes that don't really provide what we think they provide. Some of us run to alcohol. Has it numbed yet? Did it take the edge off yet? No, it hasn't. Why is that? Because it's a false refuge. I'm not saying you should never drink. I'm saying it cannot be your refuge. Is it your refuge? Did you know the leading cause of death right now for young people, 16 to 24, is drug overdose? Addiction cannot be your refuge. Some of us, when things are going crazy at home or in the world, we just dive into work. We become workaholics. It doesn't matter that my marriage is falling apart or I'm looking at porn occasionally, I'm crushing it at work. It's numbing the pain. It's numbing the pain. Some of us, we love our children. And actually, our children have become our refuge. So we're signed up for everything. We make sure they go to every practice. They're in every sport. And we're just kind of living through them as a way to keep us busy so we don't have to deal with ourselves. Some of us, sexuality is our refuge. Has that ever been anything but a mirage of happiness whenever people seek sexual experience outside of marriage and outside of God's prescription for marriage between a man and a woman? Has it ever benefited anything beyond a mirage, a desert, a complication? Some of us, we go to entertainment. We say, you know what? All this is going on. What's new on Netflix? Or we waste an hour or two scrolling TikTok. Meanwhile, we still have these deep-seated feelings going on. Some of us run to gaming and technology. It's an escape. Some of us, and this isn't a joke, it's become a joke and it doesn't need to be. Some of us run to food. We indulge. We're a little gluttonous. And we do it because we think it will give us what we want. We trust it more than we trust God's hand in our life. Why are false shelters bad? Because they fail. They don't deliver on their promise to you. They promise to give you safety and security and happiness and pleasure, and they fall short every single time. Okay, so we know what we need to do when we feel overwhelmed. We need to figure out why. We know what not to do. We need to not let the sin in that's crouching. We need to not go to a false shelter. What does David do when he's overwhelmed? Psalm 55, 16 and following says, "As for me, I call to God, and the Lord saves me. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice. He rescues me unharmed from the battle waged against me. Even though many oppose me, God, who is enthroned from of old, who does not change, he will hear them and humble them because they have no fear of God. My companion attacks his friends. He violates his covenant. His talk is smooth as butter, yet war is in his heart. His words are more soothing than oil, yet they are drawn like swords." So he's talking about what's coming at him. "Cast your cares on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken. But you, God, will bring down the wicked into a pit of decay. The bloodthirsty and deceitful will not live out their days. But as for me, I trust in you." What does David do? Despite his situation, despite his sin, he plants in the presence of God. Did you notice that? He talks about why. He pours himself out, but he's planting in the presence of God. See, when David is overwhelmed, he plants in the presence of God. He calls to God. He casts his cares on God. He doesn't seek refuge anywhere else. So as he's journeying away, he wishes he was in a desert far away, but actually he's seeking refuge in God. He's crying out to God. God, only you can do something here. Only you can deliver me. And what happens is God provides for him and his men in this desert. He sends people to bring food and encouragement, and he works out the situation for his good. Psalm 92, 12 through 13 says, "The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those who are planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God." So what do you do when you're feeling overwhelmed? You plant in the only thing more powerful than the thing that is overwhelming you. That's why false shelters don't work, because they have no power to deal with what's overwhelming you. Have you heard of palm trees and how they're able to withstand hurricane force winds? Why are they able to do this? Well, they're made a certain way. Their trunks are able to bend at a 50-degree angle. Impressive. Their roots, rather than thick and kind of singular or in one space, they're thin and they're wide, and they go across a network of the soil. And their fronds, the shape of them, are designed to not hold any extra weight. They allow wind to blow through them, and they don't hold on to water. They resist it in every way. What can we learn from a palm tree when we're going through situations of overwhelm? We can learn that we need to be able to be flexible with our will for his will. We learn that we need to be planted, not just in our place, but with the people of God, a network of roots. We learn that the shape of our practices and how we deal with the wind and the overwhelm and the rain that's coming down on us, there's certain practices that will help us, that will shape us so that we can overcome overwhelm. Prayer, meditating on God's word, meditating with God one-on-one, singing, solitude, rest, surrender. See, in the storm, David is reminded that only God can save him from being human, which is lesson number 5. Trust God to overwhelm what overwhelms you. So you got to be planted. That's part 1. You recognize that God is powerful. The second part of this is you have to actually trust him. As for me, David says, I will trust in you. Even though I'm overwhelmed, even though I'm overwhelmed by my sin, by what they did, by my circumstances, even when all I want to do is flee, notice what David says. He says, I will trust in you, God. Why? Because he says, God does not change. Only God sustains. He alone is consistent and faithful. His power is actually more powerful than the thing that I'm facing, my sin, their sin, my circumstances. He's the only one that I can take refuge in to ensure that the righteous will not be shaken. It's only him. And as he's in the desert and as he's fleeing, notice God doesn't abandon him. He shows up for him. And he does for us. You can trust God because Jesus Christ entered our humanity, literally came to our deserts. See, after his last meal with his disciples, they were about to head to a garden, the Mount Olives. Now, David passed through this mountain on his fleeing journey. And so before they head out there, here's what the disciples did. Matthew 26:30, it says, after singing psalms, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So as Jesus prepares to be overwhelmed with the full weight of sin and death, what's he doing? He's modeling for us how we deal with overwhelm. He's singing and quoting the Psalms. Men in this room, if you're not singing to the Lord, look, men sing to God. David was a more valiant warrior than any of us. You know what he did every day? He sang psalms to God. You need God in your repertoire. You need singing in your repertoire. And so here's Jesus quoting the psalm. Matthew 26:37-39 says, he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed. Do you notice that? God became human, experienced overwhelm. He was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. David wrote in his psalm, he rescues me unharmed. He does the same for you. He does it for you through Jesus. You can escape unharmed, not because of anything you do, but because Jesus stepped into our human situation and he experienced the full overwhelm of our sin on his shoulders. And he models for us the way. Surrender yourself to God. Surrender your will to God. Find shelter in God. For all of humanity, God has been pleading with human beings, do not trust in that to bring you fulfillment. Do not trust in that to bring you what you're looking for. Trust in me. Even when life is coming at you, follow me. Follow me. The promise of God for every single one of us is that through trusting in Jesus, nothing will totally overwhelm you. Not sin, and not the circumstances you're in. Why? Because Jesus was overwhelmed for you. He took the punishment we deserve, and he took it faithfully. He didn't flee. In a way, he ran to the cross because he loves you, and he wants to take the weight off of your shoulders. Jesus says, come to me, all of you who are weary, and I will give you what? Rest. It's only in Jesus. And so you're here today, and you're looking for rest, and you're looking for escape. And if you do not have a relationship with Jesus as Lord and Savior, if you haven't invited him in to overwhelm what overwhelms you, I invite you to do that today. Maybe you're here today, and you've been going to some sort of refuge, a false shelter, and you've been looking to that to provide you with what you need, and it's not providing you, guess what? God forgives you. He understands why you go there, but he says, come on out of there and let me provide refuge for you. Maybe your marriage is crumbling, but you can find refuge in him. Maybe this illness you're battling is getting more and more difficult, but let me tell you, this sickness will not end in death because Jesus has overwhelmed sin and the grave. He can be your shelter. You overcome overwhelmed when you plant in the presence of God who overwhelms everything that could possibly overwhelm you because of his power. Let's pray. Lord, I want to thank you so much. You are over everything. And today we are hearing the reality that we need to plant in your presence. We need to trust you in the storm. Some of us are feeling some heavy weights of emotion or situations in our life that are overwhelming. And right now we recognize that you are over everything. And you give us peace and rest. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Hey, would you stand? Let's sing about that.